Hey there, my name's Nick Feldman, and I'm a student pastor in the Houston, Texas area. And I chose to do my missional helix on multisite and on how churches face the challenge of growing in a way that is God honoring. And so this is something that's important to me because it's really relevant to my context. I'm in a fairly large church of about 1,500 people a week, and we find ourselves constantly needing more space. We're at 4 services, and now we're trying to decide what the best route is to grow in a way that'll give God glory and won't just bring more glory to our church's brand. And so, for that reason, I'm looking forward to spending time studying this and being able to be an influence of some sort in my church's context. So, to start off with this, I look at the theological reflection for how God does this and how God has a design for multiplication. And so, even just from the very beginning with creation, He created people to work, and then in Genesis 1:28, God commanded and made people to be able to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth, to subdue it, to rule it. He's had a plan to multiply His people. And this is true from the very beginning in Genesis 1 all the way up until Matthew 28 and the Great Commission. And when we go through that really familiar text, we see that Jesus, our King, has full authority. He's given us a command. He is with us now. And so His command matters. There's a great example later in the book of Judges that's all about Joshua. And it kind of shows us that for us, theologically, we shouldn't find our location or our one building to be the goal or the product. And in this story in Judges 2, verse 10, Joshua had been discipled by Moses, and he was now the leader. But Joshua seems to really mess up. He doesn't, whenever he takes over, he doesn't disciple anyone else to take his place. He thought that his goal was a place, but it was never really about leading people to the promised land. It was always all about leading them to God. The promised land was just a byproduct. And so for us, we see in the same way that leading people to God is the primary goal. And it's also worth noting that Paul has made it abundantly clear to Timothy that we are called to multiply leaders. In 2 Timothy 1, Paul's proven that he's multiplied himself with Timothy, and he really cares about him. And then in chapter 2 of 2 Timothy, verse 2 actually, Paul's telling Timothy to commit other faithful men to what he's learned from him. And so he's saying, I've already kind of multiplied myself into you, Timothy. You need to find other people that you can be multiplying into so that they can go and teach others. And this is a really critical piece for us understanding the theology for God's design for us to be multiplying. He also designed for stewardship. And this is worth thinking about when you start considering what's the better decision. Is it to build bigger and bigger buildings to have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7,000 people meeting in one place? Or is it better for us to go elsewhere? A great example is Jesus' parable of the talents that's in Matthew 25. I'm definitely not going to read you guys this parable. You're probably really familiar with it. But one thing you see from the very beginning, in the first verse of this, is that this is not some employer-employee relationship. This is the master to the servant, and we are in the same exact kind of roles. He's the master, we're the servant, and that's worth putting as the basis for our theological reflection. And at the same time, all of the resources are his. Just like in the parable, when this guy is giving away the talents, they are his. And all of the money, all of the people and leaders we have, all of the people who we're striving to reach, all of the things that we're dealing with in this world are God's. You see later at the very end of this parable that the way that the master of the story is going to find success is, for us, it's going to turn out to be disciple making. For him, he's saying it's about interest. For him, he's saying he wants to reap from where he has sown. He wants more than where it started with. And so the goal that God has is for us to take what he's given us and go and multiply that to make more. And I hope that we see this story, and at the end of it, we're convinced that we don't want to be seen as lazy in the master's eyes, as he says in verse 26. One thing that's worth remembering is that the call for stewardship doesn't allow for us to be greedy. And sometimes the biggest reasons why we want a bigger building and a bigger stage and more lights and cameras on us is because we've grown greedy. Titus 1 verse 7 is a text that's important for us to remember because it's for overseers specifically, and he's saying in the call and qualifications for elders not to be greedy for money. In Matthew 6, Jesus is given this great Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, don't store up for yourself or collect treasures on earth where thieves can steal and moth can destroy, because he's saying where your treasure is where your heart will be. And so he's saying, you and I, when we're trying to be good stewards of what God's given us, we're going to remember that God knows what we're treasuring when we're making these kinds of decisions. And so for that reason, just like we see in Leviticus 27:30, the church's resources need to be handled with care, because they're not just people's tithes. They're not just money in a bank. They are God's. And for that reason, they're holy and they're important. And so we move past that into kind of looking at how the culture has handled this. Some things that have been really incredible to learn about this is that multi-site churches are outgrowing single site. In other words, multi-site churches are growing much faster than just single-site church plants. And so 88 of the 100 largest churches in the United States right now are multi-site. This is a fascinating statistic. All of the big churches in America are choosing to, rather than get bigger in their one service or their one building, move outward horizontally in a multi-site fashion. 85% of multi-site churches are growing annually. And so what this is telling us is that when you start looking at multi-site churches, you're seeing that they are not just flattening out. They're growing at a rate of 14% a year. Most Southern Baptist churches would do anything to be growing at 14% a year. That's not the norm. The norm that we're seeing is how many churches are dying and slowly depleting in numbers. But multi-site churches seem to be thriving. And what's a really cool thing, despite all of the importance, and rightfully so, that we place on urban missions and in urban development with our churches, a lot of multi-site churches are able to get us in places that have been hard, where you start in a city and then you expand to a rural suburban area, because 47%, almost half of multi-site churches, have at least one campus in a small town or a rural setting. What this is doing is it's helping us to be able to focus with a multi-site strategy on getting real community in people's communities. So instead of making them drive 30 minutes to come to you in your small group, 30 minutes to come to you in your service, you're instead going out there, and they, with their neighbors, even if they're a few acres in between, they and their neighbors are able to form real meaningful community on their own. Also, what we can see is that within churches, multi-site churches are having growth. 88% of multi-site churches have reported that they've had increased participation by lay members. This is an incredible stat, because what it's saying is that in a lot of our churches that are single site, you get to the point where you're kind of stuffed, and your lay members have pretty much just been able to chew on a consumeristic mentality. In a church that's going out and planting and multiplying itself into multi-site, you're not allowed to do that, because there's so many needs for leaders. And so lay members find themselves volunteering more and getting involved more and filling more leadership roles. 87% of these pastors for these other campus pastors, they've been raised up from within their own church. They're not even being hired from the outside. They've had their own people grow up in the church, love their church, be part of the DNA of their church, and now be trained to be able to be pastors of it. An incredible thing where churches are doing a job that they need to be doing. 68% of multi-site churches have formal leadership development programs, and this is going to be key for getting these churches where they should be. Practically, there's so many advantages to going multi-site versus just going bigger. And so new buildings, the small ones are going to be $1 million up to maybe 10, but obviously you can get significantly more expensive than that. The research on how much church buildings is all over the place. But you find that the normal multi-site location is just going to be rent. It's going to come in the form of $7,500, $200,000 a year, which is a really reasonable thing to put in your budget. When you start looking at it, for $10,000 a month, a church can rent out a place and not have to worry about repairs. maintenance, a whole lot of the upkeep that comes and the bills that come, or the taxes that come from owning your own facility. It also allows for you to be really flexible. Whenever you get to this point, you can practically find yourself getting bigger and getting smaller however you need to. If you find that your church is quickly outgrowing something, you didn't just waste a couple $1,000,000 on a building and need to go to a bigger one. You can rent a bigger place. And one of the most fascinating things is this helps to break the stigma of traditional churches and the settings, because there's at least 150 million unchurched people in the U.S., and a whole lot of them don't want to step foot in church because of the preconceived stigmas that come with it. This helps you kind of meet them in a place that's a little softer, that they'll be able to look at. A historical perspective on it is something that's really been kind of sad to notice. This chart on this page is showing the population, the church to population ratio. And so this number is the number of churches per 10,000 Americans. And so in 1900, 28 churches per 10,000. And that number drops down to where we are now, where it's probably a single digit number, fewer than 10 churches per 10,000 people. And so what we've seen is over the last century, our population has gone up 4 times, quadrupled, while our churches have only gone up a half of a percentage point where they've grown. Historically, another thing that's worth pointing out is that God has a design for multiplication that has been proven in a historical perspective. So what we saw is that in 1942, there's a church that's probably the first one to do this, Highland Park Baptist Church. It's in Chattanooga, where they do a satellite. In the year 1990, there's probably only 10 multi-site churches in America. 1990. By 1998, that number goes to 100. By 2005, it's 1,500. By 2008, that's 2,000. 2012, that's 5,000. In 2014, that's 8,000. And we're likely over 10,000 multi-site churches in America. This is something that's growing because it's been working. Only 12 of the top 100 biggest churches in America are single campus locations. And so you start getting to the point where you need to try to figure out, how do we strategically implement this? How do we make this happen? And from a formation perspective, there's really 3 primary things that need to be considered before you get there. The first is how you cultivate a church leadership structure. And so I believe that biblically, the example set by the early church in the New Testament, it involves an elder's role, and it involves a plurality of elders. And Titus 1, 5 through 7 seems to be the best reason, because in this one, the term elder and overseer are interchangeable in the same verse. Verse 5 and 7 have 2 different Greek words that are used interchangeably. And so it looks like that's what the Bible's saying, but regardless of which structure you go for, the important thing here is to focus on setting your people up to position pastors and elders so they can effectively oversee the flock, the church body, and train the saints, the members of the church, for the work of the ministry. The goal is for churches to have a structure that allows for their leaders to shepherd effectively. And this means taking off their plate some of the things that shouldn't be on it. After you've got your structure, you need to have a launch team. You can do this by recruiting people from your sending church, having temporary people who are going to be a part just for a 6-month or a 1 year, 2 year time. Finding people from the outside, it doesn't really, it totally matters, but there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can go about this, and you develop them through relational discipleship. And the key here is you want to immediately get your launch team to be on the same page with you with the vision of the church. They need to be on the same page of church doctrine, and they need to be on the same page of prioritizing building relationships in their communities. And ultimately, your third thing is just going to be the obvious one, which is finding a new location. And so when churches are trying to strategically get to multisite, eventually they're going to have to get to a new location, and it doesn't need to look the way that oftentimes we think about church buildings. People are finding themselves really successful meeting in places like movie theaters and meeting in places like community centers or existing churches or schools or restaurants. Tons of places, and none of them kind of fall into the stigma that we're used to. A portable church doesn't have to stay small. So like West Ridge Church in Georgia has over 3,000 attendees per week. New Spring Church in South Carolina has over 4,000 attendees per week. And it's about location, but it's also about being careful with their stewardship in this, because ultimately our goal is not just to get bigger and build our own brand. Our goal is for us to wisely and effectively shepherd God's people use God's resources for the furthering of God's kingdom when we choose how to go multi-site.